Evening and welcome. My name is Cheryl Finley and I'm the director of the Atlanta University Center Art, History, and Curatorial Studies Collective. It's my great pleasure this evening to welcome you to our second distinguished lecture of the academic year with Dr. Bridget R. Cooks, who will be speaking on art museums and the fear of a Black planet. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all this evening and also to thank Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell, 10th President of Spelman College, the Alice L. Walton Foundation, the Department of Art and Visual Culture chaired by Myra Green, and Dr. Ayoka Chinzira, the Division Chair of the Arts. The AUC Art Collective is the first and only program of its kind in the United States designed to train the next generation of African American art museum professionals with students at Spelman College, Morehouse College, and Clark Atlanta University, and an amazing staff and also faculty in the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College. Now, before we begin today's lecture, I'd like to say a few words about our distinguished guest lecturer, Dr. Bridget R. Cooks, who is a dear friend and colleague and someone who has spent some time with us here in Atlanta virtually throughout this week. She is someone who is really well known for her work in education around museums, especially focused on African Americans and African American art and leaders in the museum industry. She's also a curator who has a couple of exhibitions that we really hope you've already had the chance to see or will have the chance to see. But let me talk a moment about Dr. Cooks's education. She holds a Ph.D. in Visual and Cultural Studies from the Department of Art History at the University of Rochester, where she studied with Douglas Crimp in their very, very well-known Visual and Cultural Studies department. She is also someone who is really well known for the work that she does in Southern California. Particularly, she holds a position at the University of California, Irvine, where she is in two departments at UCI, in the Department of Art and Art History, and also the program of ethnic study, the Department of Art and Art History and African American Studies at UCI. Now, Dr. Cooks's research looks very closely at African American art and art history. She studies Black visual culture very closely, museology, film criticism, and also looks closely at critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and feminist theory in her work and in her classroom lectures. Dr. Cooks has published widely, and in our program in curatorial studies and in art history, we are always looking to her work, especially her award-winning book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum, which was published in 2011 by the University of Massachusetts Press, and also awarded the inaugural James A. Porter and David C. Driskell Book Award in African American Art History in 2013. Dr. Cooks is an avid curator and someone who has done a number of exhibitions of note, including exhibitions on the work of many artists who are dear, especially to Southern California. And just to name a couple of those exhibitions of note recently, they include Grafton Tyler Brown, Exploring California at the Pasadena Museum of Art in California, and also Ernie Barnes, a retrospective at the California African American Museum. And then more recently, her exhibition, The Black Index, is one that has been traveling around the country, is currently in New York at Hunter College in their museum and galleries. And today in my class, which is entitled Art as Social Justice, we had the opportunity to discuss the Black Index with Dr. Cooks. I also wanted to share that Dr. Cooks is someone who is many of us, and Dr. Cooks, I think you would agree about when I say this, is someone who connects really well with everyone, with students, with artists, and especially someone who has the compassion and insight to talk very earnestly with artists of other generations. She's someone who serves on the Getty Research Institute's African American Art History Initiative, and in that capacity has participated in a number of oral histories that are dear to our field, celebrating the careers and the lives of African American artists of other generations. In addition to our exhibition that's currently on view, the Black Index, which I referenced earlier, I want to just encourage everyone who is in the Zoom today, if you haven't already had the opportunity, please check out the website for the Black Index. If you don't get a chance to see the show in New York, or you didn't get to see it in its other venues at UT Austin and also in the state of California, you might really learn a lot from this website that has a number of different offerings from the artists in the show and offerings that really help us to think really closely about the work of contemporary artists and also imaging Blackness in particular. Lastly, I just want to say that one of the exhibitions that we're really excited to know about is an exhibition that she will be doing on the work of Lava Thomas. This is a monographic exhibition that's opening in Montgomery in April, but will be coming here to Spelman College in the fall of 2022. And we're really, really excited to have that collaboration with our new museum director, Dr. Andrews, and really excited to see this work coming to the Spelman College Museum of Fine Arts. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Cooks to join us. And also, I just want to once again thank so many people who have been involved in making this event this evening possible, including Rachel Brown, our program manager, Amalade Olubuwale, our program coordinator, Fury Reed, who is in on the tech, all of our faculty and the departments at Spelman, Morehouse, and Clark Atlanta University, our museums, and of course, our illustrious students. So thank you so much. And Dr. Cooks, we really look forward to your talk and to being in conversation with you afterwards.
All right. Thank you. It's hard not to get emotional with, when a friend and your colleague that you respect so much says such wonderful things about your career. So thank you so much for that while I recover. I want to thank everyone who's here. First to Dr. Cheryl Finley for inviting me to be one of this year's distinguished guest lecturers for the Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective at the Atlanta University Center. Thank you to the students who are part of this collective, who are already leaders of their generation, and what Dr. Schmidt-Campbell, Dr. Andrews, Dr. Finley, and other people have done, it has set them up for success. And it's just historic to be able to speak with them and be a part of their education in any way. Thank you to Rachel Brown and her critical skill set to organize and present such a beautiful program from behind the scenes. It's very much appreciated. And I also want to note my excitement at having Dr. Liz Andrews at the helm of the Spelman Museum. I'm thrilled to be able to continue to work with you there in Atlanta. So we are the survivors of so many challenges that have faced us in the last 2 years. It's truly an honor to have the chance to address you today. Hope you are all staying safe and taking care of yourself as the pandemic continues to roll along and impact all of our lives. So my talk today is an amalgamation of ideas rooted in the discourses of Blackness, art, and museums. And my thoughts come from my experiences working in art museums as an educator and a curator, ideas that I discuss in my book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans in the American Art Museum. And the book has the following premise. Exhibitions of African American art in American art museums have been curated through two guiding methodologies: the anthropological approach, which displays the difference of racial Blackness from the elevated white norm, and the corrective narrative, which aims to present the work of significant and overlooked African American artists to a mainstream audience. The former methodology reflects an institutional curiosity concerning the presence of racial otherness, commonly coupled with a desire to perpetuate the superiority of Eurocentric culture through its contrast to a Black difference defined as inherently inferior. The latter methodology was formed out of the necessity to present art by African Americans and correct for its historical absence and misrepresentation in mainstream art museums. The book provides a context for contemporary exhibitions of art by Black people. And during our time together, I'd like us to consider the anxieties that Blackness provokes for rethinking art history in art museums. The matter at hand concerns the ongoing pressures museums face since the publication of Exhibiting Blackness to decolonize their spaces and rethink their functions. I'd also like to posit that a key part of the exhibition process is our responsibility as students of the arts, viewers, researchers, writers, collectors, and critics to engage and respond to the work that museums do. Although problems at the heart of questions regarding the future of Blackness in the art world today are tethered to those in my book, where we are right now reflects a unique set of anxieties. Thinking through some of them brought me back to the title of Public Enemy's infinitely influential album, Fear of a Black Planet, from which I've taken the title of my talk. In 1990, Fear of a Black Planet amplified Black voices through hip hop by setting a new bar for turntablism, eclectic sampling, and danceable rhythms combined with humor and politically astute rhymes. With this album, Public Enemy returned to the charts, energized by their 1989 hip hop anthem, Fight the Power, made popular through Spike Lee's film, Do the Right Thing. Together, Public Enemy and Lee made 1990 a very hot and very pro-Black summer. Their follow-up album, Fear of a Black Planet, gave us classics such as Welcome to the Terror Dome, 911 is a Joke, Who Stole the Soul, Burn Hollywood Burn, and the eponymous title track. As a collection, the album testified to a Black presence that exists on a different plane outside of the legal protections of liberty and justice for all. The Black Planet is a nation within a nation. It describes Black communities that become terror domes when under attack from white supremacy. Communities in which emergencies are not regarded by those who profess to protect and rescue those in need. The Black Planet is a place that suffers through white appropriation and superficial misrepresentations of its Black culture. The album insists on Black political resistance and creativity as an antidote to anti-Black pain and loss. I want to show this one next. Fear of a Black Planet, the album, was preceded the discovery of WASP 12b by NASA's Hubble Space Telescope by nearly 2 decades. Known as the oddball exoplanet, the pitch black planet lays outside of our solar system, and according to NASA is, quote, black as fresh asphalt because it eats light rather than reflecting it back to space. And I cannot help but to draw parallels between the force of Blackness in these two realms, Public Enemy on one hand and NASA on the other. The characterization of the aggressive Black planet that eats light resonates with the way in which anti-Black rhetoric describes Black Lives Matter activism as terrorism that threatens white supremacy as the norm. The cry against white supremacy and the institutions that uphold racial hierarchies permeates Fear of a Black Planet. And now, over 30 years later, that call against anti-Blackness resounds again in a response to the persistence of racism and superficial gestures in the name of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Anxiety around the absence of light, and more poignantly, the presence of darkness, socially and astronomically, presents deep anxieties around new ways of perception that threaten to distort previous laws of vision. Indeed, the art world crises around Blackness concern issues of racial parity and mixing that would force the reconfiguration of categories such as American art, modernism, and fine art, distinctions on which the authority of museums bases its value. We are living through historic times when it comes to art museums and the discourses of ethics, colonization, historical truth, and community engagement. I want to just talk about some examples of what's been going on in the art world that reflects our moment. In 2019, the Metropolitan Museum of Art unveiled 4 bronze sculptures created by Kenyan-American artist Wangeshi Mutu. The sculptures filled 4 architectural alcoves on the outside of the museum building that have sat as empty platforms since the building's completion in 1902. The commission was the first in a series of annual commissions planned for artists to make new work in response to the Met's collection. The sculptures are reimagined from ancient caryatids in which female forms have been used to uphold the weight of a structure. And here Mutu's forms sit independently with authority without the burden of supporting something else. The symbolism here is magnificent. It shows the Black female form as goddess, a terrific step towards making changes to the long troubled history of colonization at the Met. However, we as viewers have to make the museum accountable so that the artwork does not sit only as a gesture, but signals the treatment of Black people inside the galleries as well. Also in 2019, the International Council of Museums, an organization that represents over 20,000 museums across the globe, met in Japan for its annual conference. On the agenda was the vote to officially revise the definition of a museum. The proposed definition has divided its constituents, some of whom reject a new mission to promote justice in multiple forms for the planet and its people. The new definition claims an active function for museums now, and it states, quote, museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogues about the past and the futures, end quote. It also states that the museum should guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Considered too radical for many of the council's members, ICOM decided to postpone the vote, and there is no date set for the vote to happen. In 2019, the Whitney Museum of American Art faced organized and persistent protests because of the investment of Warren B. Kanders, who served as vice chairman of the museum's board of directors. The protesters, including activists in the group Decolonize This Place, objected to Kanders' ownership of Safariland, a company that manufactures the tear gas used against immigrants along the Mexico-US border. Many of the artists in the biennial called for Sanders' resignation, which came later in July. And last February, Newfields, a campus of gardens and art spaces that houses the Indianapolis Museum of Art, faced community backlash against the museum's posted job description for a new director. The ad doubled down on white supremacy, saying that the museum was interested in, quote, maintaining the museum's traditional core white audience, end of quote. While likely true, the statement conflicted with other statements made by the museum that it was interested in diversity. Newfield's president, Charles S. Venable, resigned within days of institutional pressure. And this latest scandal followed the 2020 resignation of the museum's only African-American curator, Kelly Morgan, who has gone on record in video and print to tell all about the anti-Black conditions she suffered as a museum employee. In June 2020, Neil Benezra, director of the SF MoMA San Francisco Museum of Art, apologized for deleting comments by a Black employee who called out the museum for its poor handling of anti-Black activity within the museum and its lack of response to the murder of George Floyd, who was one of 5 men killed by police across the United States on May 25th, 2020. As the assertions of the hashtags Black Lives Matter, Decolonize This Museum, and Museums Are Not Neutral movements challenge and generally perplex mainstream museum leadership, some directors and curators are facing the legacy of white supremacy and social hegemony. In the last several years, American museum directors have disrupted regular acquisition and exhibition procedures in order to claim that Black Lives Matter in their institutions. Their efforts have been lauded and criticized. In April of 2018, Christopher Bedford, director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, announced that the museum would deaccession 7 artworks, all by white men and their collection, in order to fund the accession of art by white women and artists of color. As a result, Bedford stated, the BMA acquired 11 major works of art as part of the museum's strategy to broaden the historical narrative of art and build a more diverse and inclusive art experience for Baltimore. In October 2020, a second round of deaccessioning was planned in the attempt to diversify the collection, but the auction was called off mere hours before it began. The museum faced dissent from former museum trustees and current board members who disagreed with the sale, and 2 board members rescinded promised gifts based on Bedford's deaccession plan. In February 2019, SF MoMA followed the BMA's lead with the sale of a Rothko to purchase works by makers of different racial and gender identities. These are bold gestures by these museums, but they are also unsustainable. And I'm hoping that the boards and donors of these museums and others will understand the seriousness of changing the permanent collection and commit to funding a transformational collection and exhibition practice. I'm showing these to you so that you can see the dates if people want to look them up to read the entire articles. These are just screenshots to give you an idea of how these issues are dramatized in the press. In 2017, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio formed a committee to consider what should be done about several statues in the city that promote white supremacy. One of these is the troubling sculpture Equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt from 1940, made by James Earl Fraser, which has stood in front of the American Museum of Natural History since 1940. In 2019, the museum opened an exhibition called Addressing the Statue to educate visitors and invite them to share their thoughts about the promotion of the demeaning representation of Indigenous and Black people through Fraser's work. The statue shows an Indigenous man and a Black man who walk on either side of the president, who rides above them on horseback. A month after public protests against anti-Black violence was sparked by the video recording of Minneapolis police officers murdering George Floyd, de Blasio ordered the removal of the statue. Here's a shot just to show you information inside about the exhibition that happened. And then this is a photograph that I took just a season ago. So the statue is still up. I am not sure what's taking so long, but nothing has changed. In 2020, directors of all 4 venues of the exhibition titled Philip Best and Now agreed to postpone the project over concerns that they had not communicated appropriately with Black constituents in preparation for their exhibit. In particular, the museum directors worried over the potential response by Black viewers to Guston's paintings that feature cartoonish representations of Ku Klux Klan figures. The exhibition was planned to debut at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in June 2020, before traveling to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Tate Modern in London, and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. It's unclear how the museum directors expect the anti-Black climate in museums to change, or why they believe it will be improved by 2024. But suffice it to say, these museum leaders have agreed to pause their actions for a time of reflection and reconsideration. The museum trouble that's going on now is not new, rather it is ongoing. Its history of conflict between upholding white supremacy on one hand and representing people of color respectively as equals on the other is older than the museum itself. For African American people, it has a specific, traceable history through exhibitions. In fact, it was my experiences of visiting and working in museums that encouraged me to write Exhibiting Blackness. In mainstream museums, I found the regular omission of art on view that had been created by Black artists. And when there was an exhibition of work by Black artists, I noticed a few other things. First, Black artists were featured in museums within group exhibitions about being Black. They were not regularly shown in thematic-based exhibitions around a particular style of art or a specific topic. And rarely was their work shown alongside artists who were not Black. Second, the object labels for work by Black artists stated that the artists were Black. However, labels for work by white artists did not identify them as white. Third, when an exhibition of works by Black artists was on view, when I was working at LACMA particularly, the majority of museum visitors who commented about the exhibition stated that they had never seen an artwork by a Black artist before, and they believed that that current exhibition was the first of its kind, but they wanted to know more. There are many examples that I can give you that precede the ones I've recounted, some of which you can find in Exhibiting Blackness. And the most notorious example being Harlem on My Mind, Cultural Capital of Black America, 1900 to 1968, organized by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1969. It was an exhibition that sought to trace the history and value of the predominantly Black community of Harlem in New York City. And in organizing one of the most controversial exhibitions in US history, the Met decided to exclude people from Harlem from participating in the planning and to exclude artwork by Harlem's thriving artist community. So it's hard to explain how this happened, but the Met had an exhibition dedicated to Harlem that it didn't include any art, even by the Harlem Renaissance artists. And it was the first exhibition that the Met had ever done that acknowledged Black people through place. The museum justified these decisions by arguing that Harlem itself was a work of art, and the inclusion of actual artworks in Harlem on My Mind would only detract from the overall exhibition. I want to share another example of the continuation of the anthropological and really sociological approach to showing art by Black artists. And I've included some installation shots so you can get a sense of what was in the exhibition. In 1969, art at large did not consider photography as part of its definition. So there were photographers who made work through a machine, and then there were artists who were painters and sculptors. Even though now we think of photography as art, the definition agreed upon at the time did not consider photography art. And that was one of the reasons why, of many reasons why the show is controversial. Another installation shot there. Work that wasn't, and there was work included of photographs by Black artists like James Vanderzee, which we see here on the left. And directly ahead as well. So in a more contemporary example, I want to look at this continuation of the anthropological approach to exhibiting Black artists. So every 15 years or so, either MoMA or the Phillips Collection in Washington, DC, decide to exhibit Jacob Lawrence's complete 60-panel artwork titled The Migration of the Negro, made between 1940 and 1941. And its most recent presentation was in 2015, when MoMA displayed Lawrence's work in an exhibit called One Way Ticket. Basic elements of art such as color, line, shape, and composition, and common sources for analysis such as artistic style, influences, and innovation were not part of the curatorial presentation through wall text or object labels. Although the work has strong narrative content, there is a thoughtful, formal relationship between the message in the work and its medium. At MoMA, The Migration of the Negro was presented less as an artwork and more as documentary illustration. The curators made a bank of computers central to the presentation. I think I have an installation shot here. Through digital content, the exhibition presented a team of experts of African American history and culture. And I'll show you them here. History professors, authors, curators, and performers to provide what the title wall called Other Visions of the Great Movement North. And together they formed a supplement to Lawrence's art, an informative source on the Great Migration, and ultimately a distraction away from the focus of the exhibition, which was the actual art that was in the room. So I want to cite art historian Elizabeth Berkowitz's astute analysis of the exhibition. There's an extended quote from her. She says, despite seemingly universal critical praise, MoMA's show failed to avoid the difficulty endemic to art historical emphasis on a non-white and therefore non-canonical artist. In a painstaking attempt to showcase and laud Lawrence and his work, a parade of good intentions, MoMA's one-way ticket inadvertently accomplished the opposite. One-way ticket fell into the trap of artistic pigeonholing, as the exhibition classified Lawrence as a painterly historian of African-American history rather than as an American artist who used the visual and political interests of an interwar international art scene to create works which focused on African-American subjects, end of quote from Berkowitz. So MoMA treated Lawrence as an anthropological native informant. It reinscribed racial hierarchy within its collection and in turn its exhibitions. In other words, the museum was doing too much to cover for its anxiety of showing the work of a Black artist. I want to return to the fear of a Black planet and share a few more examples of anxieties around activating and owning Blackness as a way of seeing. One example begins with artist Anish Kapoor's 2016 purchase of the exclusive rights to Vanta Black, known as the world's blackest Black substance. And this is an advertisement for Vanta Black. The substance was developed by Surrey Nanosystems for satellite-borne Black body calibration systems. The substance absorbs 99% of light, making the visibility of an object completely disappear in darkness. And I will just ask you to look at the image on the bottom right side of your screen. So we're looking at two three-dimensional sculptures, exactly the same, but one is covered with this substance called Vanta Black. And so it looks completely flat and black and matte. Vanta Black has been used in the defense and space industries in England and the United States for stealth weaponry and detection systems. Described as having the ability to make the experience of looking at any object into looking into a black hole, the liquid became appealing to visual artists interested in appropriation for illusionist possibilities. It also engendered hostility from artists who resented Kapoor's exclusive rights to the blackest Black, particularly from white British post-pop artist Stuart Semple, who started a successful Kickstarter campaign to make a blacker Black substance that would be available to all artists. And this is a cartoon created by Semple advertising his blacker Black. Pitched as, quote, the maddest paint in the whole universe, like a black hole or void in a bottle, end of quote, Semple wasn't alone in his desire to access the blackest Black. He exceeded his Kickstarter funding goal after just 38 hours and manufactured Black 3.0 in 2018. In August 2020, the color development company Pantone announced Ultra Black, a color inspired by a song of the same name by hip hop icon Nas. Here is an extended quote from the company describing the project. And I'm going to try to read this without my own commentary. A testament of the times, Ultra Black is a statement to being unapologetically pro-Black and thus pro-humanity. While the color Black often connotes feelings of darkness, Nas reimagines the term to represent its richness, complexity, and profound beauty. An electrifying phrase honoring the Black community as the life force of culture, the term extends beyond race, class, or creed. It is symbolic of the fortitude, power, legacy, and interconnectedness of all people worldwide. Just as Black absorbs all light, Ultra Black represents the unification of all people, spotlighting Black joy and the promising future ahead, end of quote. So I think what's immediately remarkable to us is how at every turn of phrase that focuses on Blackness, the text then moves away from the color to represent humanity at large, right? This is the tension that we're familiar with when we think about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And so you see this enacted in Pantone and the selling of this new color. Pantone creates Blackness in order to disarm its darkness and transform it into something for everyone. Proceeds from the sale of ultra Black swag by Nas are designated for charity. And I think charity is code here for Black organizations, but I'm not sure. They don't actually list who gets the money. What is this rush to own Blackness? Its color, its optical abilities to change perception of physical dimensions, and its association with Black excellence. And all of those things are compressed in this statement here by Pantone. How can we characterize this interest in manifesting and owning the purest Black, a Black that changes vision and defies the perception of dimensionality in space? As I've just indicated through my interpretation of Pantone's ultra Black, part of the answer is the desire to own Blackness in order to appropriate it and ultimately destroy it by redefining it through white access. At the heart of this and other answers, the relationship between Black as pigment and Black as form is key. It's something that artists have been wrestling with in artistic philosophies for generations. For example, in 2015, a joke was discovered underneath Kazimir Malevich's 1915 supremacist painting, The Black Square. Described in the New Yorker as, quote, the most famous, most enigmatic, and most frightening painting known to man, end of quote, the revelation of the hidden text offers new interpretations of the Black monochromatic. In the white border of the painting is the message in Malevich's handwriting that translates in English as Negroes battling in a cave. The artist's racist joke transforms the painting into an image of Black flesh in conflict and equates the color Black as a representation of people of African descent. As filmmaker Arthur Jafa has explained, the implications of accessing the embodiment of Black people through modernist abstraction demands some major reconsiderations of the conceptual origins and parameters of modernism. We need to consider several things, he says: how Black bodies activate space, or the volumetric intensities of Black bodies in cities, the attraction of the entropic, the state of disorder and decline, modernism as a substrand of Black aesthetics, and the Black body as the premier anti-tropic figure in the 20th century. The trauma provoked by the introduction of the Black body into white space is profound. And that's the end of the quote by Jafa. Malevich's description of his painting references Blackness in social space and opens up another understanding of the debt that modernism owes to Black people and the phantasm of Blackness in the white imaginary. In matters of perception, experience, and force, Blackness shows its relevance for art and visuality. Its interpretation demonstrates the fact that Black lives matter and Black art matters. And I'll end with a thought that comes from visual studies scholar Keith Moxie. As viewers, we engage with artwork on at least two registers that we can call presentation and representation. There is the visual presentation of the object that has a presence and takes up space in a gallery. It is hung, it is lit, it is visible and presented. Then there is representation, which is how we perceive and understand what we see. What do we perceive in that object as the subject matter? What is depicted in the picture, and how is it depicted? Our job in viewing, thinking, and writing is to pay attention to both registers. We should let the art signify, and we should be challenged by it, not in fear, but for the possibility of new ways of seeing. We will only see Black futures in museums that are different and more dimensional than the ones that we have seen in the past when curators and directors confront their fears of a Black planet. It is an inevitable place created by white supremacy that they're scrambling to deny and control. The foundations of our history are at stake, and the evidence of Black brilliance blinds the gatekeepers who are afraid of the dark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooks.
Thanks,
Thank
Dr. Finley. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
You can like hear that amplified by 100 times or more. Yes, we see all of the thank yous coming
Thanks,
in.
everybody.
So Yeah, so first I just wanted to say to everyone who's here with us, please, I know that you have questions. I see many of our AUC Art Collective students, art history majors, curatorial studies minors, art insiders. Please put your questions in the Q&A function. That's where we would prefer them to go. But you can also use the chat, but please, the Q&A function is preferred. So again, Dr. Cooks, thank you so very much. Every time I'm in your presence and hear you share with us, I'm always stimulated. I'm always thinking of not just the history of art and how Black artists and Black creatives, Black art historians and thinkers figure into this history, but how we, as educators and our students working together can help to change and shape and reshape this field. And you're such a bold example of, ways that this can be done through the exhibitions that you have currently on view and coming down the pike. Again, we talked about the Black Index in art as social justice, and really, thinking about the relationship between making an exhibition and then making it actually, do something, for the museum, for the artists, and for the people, right? And I think I have a couple of questions that I could start with, but I know our students are quickly typing their questions as well, and anyone who's on Zoom with us today. But I wanted to ask you if you could maybe just begin by saying something more, because I heard this word more than once, but saying something more about, the anxieties of the museum, right? And this word anxiety, right? So we can, I know,
Yeah.
there's so many ways we can feel it, at the AUC. There's so many ways we can think about anxiety in, many things that we as Black people have faced of late. But, especially you in your, long and illustrious career, in the museum and in the academy, and I think any one of us who, is a Black person working in this industry has felt in terms of, anxiety walking into these spaces. I'd love to hear you say more about this notion of anxiety, because it's real. It's not just a notion. Actually, we feel it. But, how we can take, the energy from that feeling, which is one of discomfort. It's one of, some of those images of Titus Kaphars that are just kind of like, blurred, right? But how do we take that energy and harness it to create, a better Black art future, in these institutions? And I think you started talking about ways that, we can think about the structure, because I think that there's certain structures within the so-called museum and its definition that need to change in order for things to change.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response. And anxiety, I mean, I think everyone is experiencing anxiety in general, especially for the last 2 years. We've been, I think, better about talking about it. I think that in the art world, all museums have is a reputation of authority. They hold a very privileged place in their respective cities, their communities, their states, their national presences, right? And that is their power, right? They have the power to represent, and they have the attention of people who define them as an institution where you go, like universities, where you can find truth.
Right.
Right. So what's been happening, like I talk about in the book, for the last 100 years, the first mainstream exhibition of art by Black artists happening in 1927. So it's literally almost 100 years. We have this crisis in museum leadership, who are not Black, of course, who are saying, we know, we are the experts. And um, over this past about 100 years, we have Black people who are saying, I have information that you don't know. I have information that you've ignored. I have information that is a threat to you, right? That Black people have intellectual capacity, that Black people can be creative and innovative thinkers in the visual arts, right? I think we've been allowed to have entertainment value and music, as well as real skill that isn't always acknowledged as skill, but instead is naturalized as the gift of rhythm, right? So music has a history, dance has a history, drama has a history, right? And you have Black people who have been fighting for true equity in terms of the way that they are represented, the way that critics talk about their performances, right? And so we have it also in the art world. And so part of the anxiety, I believe, is that museums don't want to give up their authority, and they're afraid to say that they were wrong,
Mhm.
that they got it wrong. They're also afraid to say that the art world is a living, moving thing. The way we understand and represent the past changes. Okay. And I think you mentioned Titus Kafar's work. I mean, he's someone that through his work, many of his series is remaking historical paintings and trying to tell a truth
Right.
with the way in which he presents Black and white figures in relationship to each other. So um, I would say, and I know there's other questions and I could go on, but I would say the answer or the resolution to anxiety, and I say this also even when it comes to just nerves, you're going to do something and you're afraid, but it's the right thing or something you've been working on. The answer to anxiety in this context is research. Do your research. You can be any color and do your research. We need white museum directors and curators of American art who've been ignoring Black artists for years to do their research. Then they will be informed, and then that will hopefully be reflected in their representations of American art.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. You're absolutely right. I mean, doing the research, making sure that you're aware of what time it is and
Right.
what's actually going on, what the history is, but also what the present is and how that can affect us in the future. I was even thinking, as you were answering the question too, about, because I think that part of this anxiety has to do with, with these structures. And we know, of course, that, museums are being built all the time, right?
Mhm.
They're being built everywhere all the time. And there's almost a way in which I think about the museum, as we know it, the museums as we know them, and, the monuments, as we know them, and even, the monument, the Equestrian Teddy Roosevelt monument that you referenced. And it makes me, wonder if one of the, another sources of this anxiety might have to do with the inability of large institutions to have the sort of the flexibility or the open-mindedness or the diversity of thought to be nimble, to the type of change that needs to happen, right?
Yeah,
So,
museums are not nimble. I mean, there are some examples. I would say, and part of me doesn't want to start making a list because I'll leave someone out that I can't think of. But I would
and
say,
we might run out of time even.
yes. But one example of a museum that I do think has been nimble is the Hammer Museum in LA.
Yes,
But
Eric.
they have, yeah, but what have they done? They have a director who's interested in
Mhm.
learning. It is technically a university museum.
Right.
So I think it benefits from being part of a institution of knowledge
Mhm.
and knowledge production
Right.
and student research and student activity and student input, right? Because as long as you have the next generation of emerging scholars involved, you're going to have to be nimble
Right.
and you'll be
Right.
challenged. That's how development happens. Um, but they have also hired Erin Christoval, for example, who's an amazing curator who did one of the best shows I've ever seen last year called No Humans Allowed.
Yes.
That has a publication, right? So that the exhibition lives on. It becomes part of an archive. Um, they have been responsive to contemporary art. They have a biennial made in LA, right? I mean, they are nimble. We go to them to learn more about ourselves and our past and our current moment. It's a very different kind of museum from the Met.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but then, we'll look at a museum like the Met and see they have this new Afrofuturist period room. We
Right.
need to take a field trip there and talk about what's going on. This is up indefinitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
people aren't, yeah, go ahead.
no, no, go on.
I was just going to say, we don't expect that from the Met.
Right.
I mean, me at number one, I don't expect that from the Met, right? Because I've written about them so much, but they have 3 Black curators now. And
Exactly.
out of dozens, but they have 3 Black curators, and um, I don't think that the Met is their curatorial team is a united. They all have the same ideas about race, but those who are able to get through are able to do some things that are unexpected, like that room.
Right.
So anyway, there's more
So
examples, but
there's so many more examples, but I think that, the one that you've given of, both the hammer and we were all, there together at a really fun and I think friendly family opening
mhm,
very recently. And the work that Erin is doing has been stand out for students in our program for sure.
mhm,
Connections and mentorship that she's also been able to provide.
mhm.
But I also wanted to say that, thinking about that room, at the Met also tees up our first question. Um,
Okay, great.
yeah. So this is a question from Mia Skaggs, who is an LA art insider.
Oh,
Um,
good.
and so you may have had the opportunity to meet her in November when we were there together as a group to celebrate Dr. Liz Andrews and Christine Y. Kim's exhibitions at LACMA, opening the Obama Portraits and Black American Portraits.
Mhm.
And so Mia asks, how can Afrofuturism play an important role in capturing the future of Blackness in America and on a worldwide scale?
Yeah, I love that. That's like a topic of a weekend retreat, because we have such a great history in Afrofuturism when we think about science fiction,
Mhm.
So we'd have to look at advances made in creativity and intellectual thought in literature. We'd have to look at music, right? We'd have to go take a trip to Noah Purifoy's Outdoor Desert Museum in Joshua Tree.
Absolutely.
These are people, and a number of other artists. David Huffman is one that immediately comes to mind, a Bay Area artist who's one of the first visual Afrofuturist artists. And there is this exhibition, Afrofuturism, that's up right now at the Oakland Museum as well. So um, what these artists and writers and curators are doing is trying to imagine Black futures. And the Black futures are informed by our past. It's not like some, I don't know, utopia that's, it could be anyone's paradise. It could be, no, like a Black utopia or an Afrofuturism is informed by our past and is very connected to where we are, how we are treated today, and then tries to create a future that in some ways I think it's always visionary, but there are lessons that are learned. There are different power structures that I think can inspire us, right? So that we're not, I mean, in some ways, very much today, we are living in a science fiction world, right? I mean, with the pandemic alone, how many movies, action thrillers have been based on a pandemic that happens and a post-apocalyptic world, right? But Black people survive those apocalypses, right? How do we survive? What structures change that necessitate that we exist in the future? And I think that visionaries who are part of Afrofuturism in all its forms can help inspire us to figure out new methodologies, new ways of connecting with each other, spiritual connections, ancestral connections, to try to figure out like what's our next migration, you
Right.
know?
And I was going to say, I mean, to that end, and thinking about the last 2 years, we had a working group at Spelman where we got together, a number of faculty members to read Parable of the Sower,
Oh,
to also
great.
think about, what can we read? What can we read from, our sociologists, our Afrofuturist writers, whether it's in literature or poetry, what can we read in order to try to understand the moment that we're in? And this is at the very beginning, of the pandemic. And what can we read that's going to give us the type of sustenance we need to get through? And so I think that, Mia, in answer to your question too, it's thinking about these, writers and scholars and artists, of course, visual artists who, and musicians,
Yes,
the
right.
Ship Connection, right?
Right.
Who have Sun Ra, yeah, absolutely. But who've really helped to guide us through and continue to with their work. And Mia is a graduating senior, I hope I get this right, who's in doc film. So, we're looking forward to your work and also helping to answer this question, in a worldwide, scale, because I think that's another part in terms of like amplifying, what we can do as a people to, not just in our own locales, in our own backyards, but also, more in a more worldwide scale, as she asks.
Yeah, some people I've talked to are frustrated with Afrofuturism because they want it to be a blueprint. They want it to be a guide of like, this is what you do. And it's like, no, this involves
Toolkit.
it's not a toolkit, it's inspiration.
Yeah.
And it is vision. I wrote an essay that came out recently in this book. I don't know if you can see it with my background. I'll just tell you the title of it. It's called The Invention of the American Desert. And I write about Colleen Smith's work, who I do think about as being an Afrofuturist in a lot of her work, Noah Purifoy. And there's a film that I wanted to mention, a Black British film called The Last Angel of History that you can watch on Vimeo or YouTube that I talk about. And the title of this essay is The Desert as Black Mythology. So I'll leave it there. But anyway, the name of the book again is The Invention of the American Desert. And I focus on Noah Purifoy's site out in Joshua Tree, his outdoor museum.
Great. Well, we'll pick it up and teach it. And I'm looking forward to reading it and also having a trip there one day.
Yeah, that is another Spelman field trip. Absolutely.
Hey, yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it. All right. So we have a question here from Sage Caballero, who asks, how do you grapple with holding museums accountable when they make statements regarding Black Lives Matter? At what point does it shift from optics and making statements to actually making change in your eyes?
So far, it's been almost 100% optics. I think that museums, when they post Black Lives Matter, and I think for them it's a marketing issue, like it's a public relations campaign, and it doesn't actually have any connection with the permanent collection, the staff, right, at all levels, right?
Well, if we look at what was it, June 2020, right? That's when there were so many, museums. Well, there were posts, but also there were posts where a lot of people had to kind of eat their words, or they had put their feet in their mouths. And so I think that you're right in terms of that, idea of this, okay, well, we have to respond to this moment because, we're being told to post without actually clearing whatever the statement might be with whom, with, visitors, perhaps, with community members, with boards of directors, curators.
Right. And that's what's been happening. This happened, the example of Neil Benezra that I gave, the museum posted something about Black Lives Matter at SF MoMA. Then someone who was Black who had worked at the museum called them out on social media, and it was like, no, no, they don't, not at your institution, and started naming names. Like, in this meeting that I was in, this person said this. I mean, it was just like, there's the experience. And so then the director took the Black person, the former employee's comments down. So it's like, no, let me say Black Lives Matter, even though we know they don't. We don't need Black people telling us that we're wrong. And so then he got called out for that on social media, and social media has opened up this vulnerability for museums that I think is long overdue, where people can just post and say, that's not true, in an equitable way. And so to have the director then take down Black voices and testimony, then Ben-Ezra had to apologize for that. I'm sorry I took them down. But what has happened since then? I don't know. I know they're looking for a director. And I think one thing that the last 2 years have exposed for museums as they felt this pressure to post, is that there is no, like I was saying with the Met curators, there is no single mind. Some curators, I'm sure, are not interested in Black Lives Matter. Some are probably upset and they find it irritating, and other people are like, of course, Black Lives Matter, we need to do a better job. So I think directors are finding that there is no consensus, is the word I'm looking for, within the curatorial staff, and in the broader staff overall. So they're posting things and people from the inside are saying,
You don't
that's not
represent
true.
our views. Yeah, yeah. So I want to pivot and maybe ask I think, maybe go down a related pathway, and that is to the, and you mentioned this, you mentioned, you talked about, well, this is going to be my attempt at paraphrasing, because I'm not sure that I'm finding what I'm looking for in my notes here, but, you're essentially saying that, many of these DEI and B, DEI and A efforts are kind of hollow, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think we had a little, exchange about this at Nana's conference.
Yeah.
At least I remember, I think, trying to, post a question in the chat. And I'd love to hear you say more about that, because, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that while on the one hand, and some of us, have lived long enough, I'll raise my hand if I can show it here. There's my hand. Anyway, some of us have lived long enough to have, lived through the 80s, right?
Yeah.
With the culture wars, and
Mhm.
lived even, maybe 20 years later, right? To, experience these fits and starts. And here we are, about 2 years in, to another iteration of that. And what do you see, has anything changed? Do you see anything changing,
Mhm.
where these conversations are being had? We see, every month, someone new being promoted or hired into a new
Mhm.
position. And these are wonderful, wonderful advancements. But maybe the question is too, what else has to change along with that?
Right. Yes. So I want to answer your question. And before I do, there's something that came in the chat that I just want to say. Eve Sheila, who's a friend from LACMA, she says that SF MoMA just hired Chris Bedford, who was the former Baltimore Museum of Art director. So very interesting. And I had mentioned Chris in my talk because he was doing that bold sale of work. And then MoMA and SF MoMA was doing it too. And now he's moved to SF MoMA. So we'll see what happens next. So I don't think that much has changed when it comes to these, diversity, equity, inclusion. People make committees, and then eventually the committee will often make a report, and then the report sits on somebody's desk. I mean, that's, as someone who has worked in, museums as a major bureaucracy, and universities and as another major bureaucracy, that's kind of just how it works. So I do get excited when I see people hired in these positions, like, for the first time. There was just Kimberly Drew is now associate curator, associate director at Pace Galleries. And there was just this great article in the LA Times about the California African American Museum being an all Black female leadership. And then we also have Black curators who were brought in, the first Black curators of the institution's history at different museums. And my hope at best is that they're able to really do what they want to do, to make the change, to do the exhibitions, the programs that need to be done. At worst, I fear that the other curators all exhale, like, whew, great, we got one. And now we can just do what we've been doing.
Keep it moving, yeah.
Exactly.
But we talked about this in class today, because you pointed out how, often at, predominantly white institutions, and we were talking about educational institutions, that you have, one professor of African American art. You might have a professor of African art, but that professor of African art probably is not of African descent, right? So that you're the only one in your department. And I would say, just kind of bringing this to the museum, that often when that curator is hired, they're the one person in their department, or in their even in their entire museum.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't, imagine, and some of you who are here don't have to imagine, when you are the only one, how much responsibility, that burden of representation that you hold, that you didn't ask for, right? But it's not about just adding a Black person and then everything is solved. You have to rethink structures of power. So, it's like, well, I teach 19th century, or let's say I'm a curator, right? My area is 19th century French painting. Why would I have to do anything differently because the museum posted something about Black Lives Matter? Or I am a curator of 17th century Dutch seascapes, right? These are like low-hanging fruit, right? What would I have to do in my galleries that show these trade ships, right, on the ocean? Why would I have to do anything differently to address how Black Lives Matter? Those are not hypothetical questions.
They're real.
Not rhetorical questions either. They're questions with answers. So, there needs to be a shift, not a sigh of relief that says, now people will stop being angry with us, and now we have one, and I can just do what I normally do.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have a number of other questions. I think I'll move back to the questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Joe Williams, who says, I appreciated your overview of performative de-accession trends and instances media has dramatized these moments. In your perspective, what has been the most substantial and authentic attempt at reparations from a white-led museum?
Oh my gosh. That is such a good question. I think I would really need to think about that more, but to give a good answer, because that deserves a good answer. But I will say that, Chris Bedford's initial sale, that was, I don't think it was totally performative. I think it was bold and really shocking, but he did sell the work, and he did buy the work that he wanted to buy. It wasn't a threat. He did that. It's not a sustainable model, but I think what it shows is also how serious he was, but number two, how difficult it is. And I don't know that, I've never worked at the museum, I don't have any insider knowledge, but why would you have to sell something in order to buy something else? Ideally, you want to be able to have supporters who are saying, we need change and we want to build the collection. not replace the collection, you know, with some of those words.
Change it, right? You know,
Right,
'cause
it's an exchange. No, those portraits, you know, one was, I think, a Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. Let's hang that differently.
Mhm,
Like,
mhm,
what are the stories that we need to tell about George Washington?
mhm,
You
mhm.
know, this is again getting to the permanent collection. And because, and so I keep saying the permanent collection because the permanent collection is the identity of the museum. It is their collateral, it is their capital. But their boards of museums, which are largely very wealthy people who are not interested in Black Lives Mattering at all, they're the ones with the funds that help direct what is shown and what isn't, and what is purchased and what isn't.
Mhm.
So those funding streams have to change. I think what Bedford did, yeah, it was just really bold. I mean, when I read it, I couldn't believe that it was happening, but he did do it. And when you go to the Baltimore Museum of Art and you walk through their American galleries, it's a history of American art that I've never seen um, presented in such a pro-Black way.
Mhm.
And I think Bedford has been really, and I don't know Bedford. I'm not trying to, you know, hold him up as a hero. I don't know him.
He's been a friend to our program,
Oh,
and
great.
yeah, he's been really supportive of our program, our students, and in our
Wow.
first virtual internship program, he shared with us, you know, his perspective. He talked very much about, you know, this moment of deaccession and what it meant, and the way that he took time to listen to community members, to staff,
Mhm.
curators, and to the board as he made the changes that he made at the BMA.
That's incredible. Yeah, I just say I don't know him because I don't want people to think that, you know, I'm biased and he's a, you know, I just don't know
Yeah,
him.
you know.
But it's great to hear that he has, I mean, he seems sincere. The fact that he's
Oh,
meeting with
yeah, no,
you guys, and
he's so sincere. He's all about it. Yeah.
so
He's
yeah,
super.
so I don't think that's performative. I'm not sure for other institutions that have tried to do it if it's also sincere or it might be performative at other places. Um, I think in terms of reparations, which is so fun to think about how we would envision the museum differently through a lens of reparations, there would have to be transformative change of the collection, the galleries, the museum architecture,
Totally architecture.
the directors, you know, and it's
Even the
interesting.
structure, because you referenced the board too, and I
Yes, the
just
structures of the
I think
board.
that, like, the physical structure of the space itself, but
Yes.
also, you know, the governing structures of the institution.
Yeah, the
Uh,
infrastructure and the structure.
mhm.
Yeah, we need Mabel O. Wilson in here, and she can
Hey.
talk to us about the structures, you know, and
Right.
she's so invested in Black architects and the representation of Black spaces through architecture.
Mhm.
She would be on the new board,
Yes.
you know. So it's a maybe I should write an article, the reparations in the American Art Museum.
Yeah.
And then, you know, that would be Black reparations, but the museum's got a lot of stuff that they shouldn't have internationally as well.
Right.
We talk about looting and repatriation, right? So it's, I think museums, in terms of anxiety, going back to your first question, they're afraid to even start
Right.
to
And
say,
also, I'm sorry, go on.
no, they're just afraid to start to say we need to do things differently.
Right. Right. And just thinking about, you know, the collections too, it's not just what's been acquired nefariously, but it's also there's just so much, right? But we never get to really see it. So if we talk
Right.
about, you know, architecture and structures and you know, infrastructure rather, you know, how are there ways that, you know, objects from institutions might be more readily seen or
Hmm.
accessible to, you know, to different communities?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's so many options. And there's some creative opportunities here.
Mhm.
Um, but museums are not nimble. most museums are not nimble, and it just, I think, terrifies leadership to think about how things could be done differently.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, that was such a rich answer. Thank you for the question, Joe Williams.
Yeah, thank you.
So we are going to move to a question from Ashley. And this question is, what is an ethical way for museums to deal with popular works that have demeaning depictions of Black people?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind was Fred Wilson. So, and what that means is, let's look at the artists of multiple generations who have been using those works in their art. Fred Wilson comes to mind, Betty Saar comes to mind. We can think about, yeah, I remember photo series from David Leventhal. We can think about work by Renee Cox, right? I mean, there are many artists, and there's a longer list, you guys. I'm sorry that I'm not coming up with other names in my head right now, but that's not everybody. But we need to look to see what the artists have already done. And I think we can take clues from them. There was an exhibition and a film called Ethnic Notions, based in the Bay Area. It was first shown at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. And then there's the great film by Marilyn Riggs called Ethnic Notions, which deals with this Black Americana. And that's what I'm thinking about from the question in particular. So let's look at what artists have already done in terms of recontextualizing the work, informing the way that people see the work, having us think critically about the function, the original functions, and the continued proliferation of these objects. Carrie Mae Weems, let's look at her Ain't Jokin' series. I would start with the artists as our primary visionaries, and then figure out what can we do with these objects. There are also museums, small museums that show this work, and I would be in consultation with them also about what they want, what their experiences have been in terms of feedback from their communities, but also what do they want visitors to know? Like, what is it? What is the end game for us with these objects? And what can we learn from them, and how do we I won't say necessarily incorporate them, but how do we address them as part of our history? I mean, that's something that is not a new question, but I think it would be great to continue the conversation and see how do we answer it now in 2022.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes too, it's definitely looking to the artists clearly, because that's part of the, embedded in the question, but it's what the curators might do, what the museum might do, but then we as visitors also play a role, right? And so sometimes there might be the case where if there are offensive images or an offensive exhibition, and we can, maybe go back to, well, it's more about the process in some ways, but if we go back to Harlem on My Mind, right? Protest is a form of really trying to understand and react to and process images or exhibitions that we feel are not representative or inclusive of our histories or our expertise or ideas. And I wanted to maybe just interject a question for you about Harlem on My Mind, if you don't mind.
No, not at all, of course.
So, because we all teach it, we all study it. I'm in Rochester, right?
Yes.
And so I'm sorry, which is your alma mater at the University of Rochester. I had a great day, but there's this light that keeps turning off, so I'm trying to. It's a motion detected light, anyway. But my question is, and I really like the way that you framed it, because you talked about it, and often, in the critique of this exhibition, there's rarely, I think, a conversation about, how do I put it? the role that maybe the curators thought photography was playing, as at least in the Met's terms at that time, it was not considered to be art, right? And many other places as well. And so I guess my question is, is there anything redeeming about that show? About what that show, and I feel like I'm asking a question that I know the answer to probably, and maybe I'm not trying to be performative in any way, but I think that there are ways that that show, I mean, Van der Zee's one huge example, of course, but but other ways that the show was also redeeming, because in a way, whenever you show those installation shots, which I love, some of them seem so incredibly today, like really, contemporary.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have anything more to say about that, but I'd like to hear your opinion.
Yeah. I think there were many people, and Black people included, who went to the show who didn't know anything about the controversy. And they, I think, had a variety of experiences, but I imagine that one of the takeaways was how incredible it was to walk into the Metropolitan Museum of Art and see pictures of Black people. And even if I was there and I knew about the controversy, I might have felt the same way. I mean, totally unprecedented. Seeing the work, some of the work was by Black artists. Gordon Parks was represented in the show. And as you said, James Van der Zee, this is how he was rediscovered. And the Met, a month ago, just bought the archive so that we can actually now have much easier access to Van der Zee's body of work. I mean, this is incredible. And one of those full circle moments, it means something when a museum uses their capital to support the work of a Black artist. So Van der Zee's work, may have been purchased by the Met 60 years later, if they never did Harlem on My Mind, but it's likely related.
Yes,
right?
it's very related.
Yes. And I think Thelma Golden was instrumental in that relationship between the Van der Zee estate and the Met. So many things have happened between 1969 and today for that to happen. Our mentor, Deborah Willis, went to see Harlem on My Mind.
Yes.
One of the things that encouraged her to be the person that she is today in terms of her contributions to photo history. So I think that there were some good things that came out of it. I don't think the curator should get the credit for that. And I don't think that's what you're saying, but it's like, it's not like, oh, well, it's all good because, you have Bearden offering to say, Romare Bearden, let me help you. And the, curator saying, no, we got this. We know Black culture better than you, and we don't want any artists involved. And we're one of the most powerful art museums in the world.
And also looking at that, like in the timing of, his decision, with Critchlow and others to start Cinque Gallery, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, so within the year, he had, Romare Bearden had 2 exhibitions in New York, one at MoMA with Richard Hunt, a Black sculptor, and the other one at the Studio Museum in Harlem.
Right.
Well, why would a Black artist have to have 2 solo exhibitions at the same time? Not sort of designed to be part 1 and part 2, but it's like the same show in one place and then in another. It's because we have very segregated spaces in the art world. And for him to reach audiences at MoMA, right, he'd have to go to MoMA. If he wants to meet, to reach audiences, it's a totally different audience, right? At that time, he would go to Harlem to see his work. So the art world, you had to be, as a successful Black artist, you couldn't just make the art, right? Like you're invested in your art, the art of your college, your well-being, right? And so you become an activist, right? And you have to navigate these segregated spaces and the challenges that you face because of the way that power is not equally distributed. So that Black people cannot represent themselves at the Met in a show about themselves. It doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
So,
So, Dr. Cooks, we have maybe 1.5 minutes left.
okay.
And I thought there's one question, there are a couple more questions, but there's one I think that kind of dovetails with what we've just been discussing. And this is from Aisha Mernick, who asks, those of us engaged in organizing for equity within arts organizations have experienced so many of these common pitfalls, performative sidesteps, and enduring anti-Blackness that you mention and critique in your work. What advice do you have for us to demanding actual, sustainable change within these spaces? Maybe if there's a sentence or a word to try to, I know it cannot be answered in such a short string of words, but I think that this is something we've been talking about throughout.
Yeah, this is a really important question. I feel the emotion in that question. I appreciate it. I would say try to get these conversations beyond the committee throughout, let it permeate the organization, because often when you have these the different acronyms, CIEA, and right, you pick the people who already know that this is important, right? It's the preaching to the choir. And if there's a way that you can structure the substance of the committee to necessarily involve the people that need to be there and aren't there, that is a challenge. It will be a challenge to even be in conversation with those people, but I don't think anything will change until the people that really need to be challenged in terms of anti-Blackness are part of the conversations.
Right.
That's
and I
hard.
think it's hard, but there's one other thing that you said earlier on, Dr. Cooks. You said, well, maybe I'll write an op-ed about that, right? And so I think it's also, continuing to do the work of advocacy through your talent. If you're an artist, if you're an activist, if you're someone who can write, to be able to make sure that your words and your vision can be accessed in ways that might affect the who are at the moment in positions of power and who might be able to learn from you and affect change. So, having that voice, and I think it's a great idea. We look forward to the article, Dr. Cooks.
How did I set myself up for that? I heard myself say that and I thought, uh-oh. I will seriously think about it. I'll send it to you to read.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a lovely evening. So much pleasure and
it's great
of wisdom. Thank you so much for a great friend and colleague to the AUC Art Collective. I know that our professors and our students, our staff, and the administration here at Spelman College, we're so thankful to your work, Dr. Cooks, and we look forward to continuing our relationship as years go on.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
And we look forward to seeing you.
Yes, in person.
I was going to say in fall 2022 for the opening of Lava Thomas.
Lava Thomas. Yeah, we have wonderful supporters for that show. I'm really excited that we'll be able to have it there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.